I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television. Coming to you from London, but discussing Russia and Ukraine. Relations between Russia and Ukraine were pregnant with potential problems right from the very minute that the USSR broke up. After all, Ukraine as we know it only existed as a homogeneous territory since its incorporation into the former Soviet Union. A substantial part of the Ukrainian population were Russian nationals in some case, Russian language speakers, culturally Russian, and of course Russian naval assets in the Crimea were of vital, essential importance to the modern Russian state. None of that needed to become a problem because President Reagan, in the famous walk in the woods with former Communist Party leader Mikhail Gorbachev, promised that the encroachment on Russia with the fall of the Soviet Union would be no threat to the country, that NATO would not move its tanks onto Russia's lawn. None of these promises were, of course, kept, and from the beginning, the Ukraine has been something of a cat's paw against Russia by the West. And that cat's paw became a spear when a violent coup d'etat overthrew the government of Ukraine, set the parliament on fire, set the president running, and forced at gunpoint the legislators in the Ukrainian assembly to delegitimize the Russian language as one of its very first acts. The people in the east of Ukraine, the Russian people, something like 25% of the whole Ukrainian population, maybe more than that, instantly felt under threat. Russia felt that its presence in Crimea was in imminent danger. And everyone knows what happened next. But in the last few weeks, the bubbling under crisis has erupted into a potential war between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine cannot be certain in such a conflict of Western military support. And if the West gave military support to the government in Kiev, then we could be looking at a European war which could quickly escalate into nuclear weapons exchanges. And then all bets would be off. I am joined by an audience of distinguished experts with different points of view on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And let's get down to the discussion. Nikolai Gorshkov is a former director and editor at Sputnik News, which is one of the state-backed Russian media for which I myself work. He is now an independent journalist. Formerly, between 2008 and 2013, he was the head of BBC Ukraine. So you've looked at live, Nikolai, from two very different sides. Summarize for us, if you would, the situation we're now in.
Well, the situation we are now in could not have been here if Ukraine actually made good on her own promise when she became independent back in 1991. And it was in the letter by the first independent President Kravchuk to John Major, the then Prime Minister of Britain, and other heads of government and state, that Ukraine was planning to become a neutral, non-aligned country which respects human rights and respects the cultural diversity of the country. None of this happened under the duress, one might say, because having worked in Kiev and having mingled with foreign diplomats there, especially the British diplomats, I heard from them that the remit, for example, of the British embassy in Ukraine was to integrate Ukraine into Western structures. And it's a direct quote from a charge d'affaires of the British embassy. It was about 2010, when Yanukovych was actually elected. So you said that Ukraine has been a homogeneous territory in its own right only for the past 30 years. I wouldn't agree that it was homogeneous ever, because, as you rightly said, East Ukraine is heavily Russified, and these people are indigenous to that part of Ukraine. To my British friends, I always say that if they want to better understand what's going on in Donbass in East Ukraine, think of Northern Ireland. The north of the island was colonized by the Scottish, the British, basically, and they didn't want to stay with the independent Catholic Ireland 100 years ago. Basically, the same happens in East Ukraine, because the people there, they speak Russian language, and they follow the Russian Orthodox Church. And we all know that under the previous president Poroshenko, there was a schism in the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and it was forcefully converted basically by the politicians into an independent Ukrainian church. So basically the fault lines are now running in Ukraine, not just along the language, but also along religious lines, which is almost identical to what happened in Ireland.
How much of this is driven by Western plans to force or prize Ukraine into a spearhead position against Russia, and how much of it is driven by incipient Ukrainian nationalism and a visceral dislike of Russia?
It's, I would say, 50-50. You also have to put into the picture the so-called oligarchs, Ukrainian oligarchs, because under Yanukovych, for example, the ousted president, the country was run, bits and pieces of the country were run by different oligarchs. In the east, it was Rinat Akhmetov, for example, in the Donetsk area, the one who made his fortune on coal and steel and privatizing the Soviet-era industrial assets. In the west, it would be somebody like Kolomoisky, for example, who made his fortune on financial capital, you know, in banking and the rest. If we look at the incipient nationalist sentiment, it could be something like 15 to 20, maybe 25% of Ukraine. The east of Ukraine as incipiently pro-Russian as the west of Ukraine is incipiently pro-Western. So there were three factors, basically. The desire of the West to integrate Ukraine into Western structures, the nationalism of Western Ukraine, and the desire of the oligarchs to depose Yanukovych because he was a business rival. And actually, he did a huge mistake by allowing his son, Alexander, to amass a huge fortune in Ukraine at the expense of other oligarchs. And they all conspired.
Many in the Arab world will recognize that phenomenon, let me tell you. We'll come back to you, of course. Dr. Neil Faulkner, author of People's History book and expert in Russian history, is a research fellow at the University of Bristol and the editor of Military History Monthly. You must have been looking, Doctor, at the build-up of the Russian forces inside the Russian border territory, but clearly headed for and then camped on the border with Ukraine with some trepidation, were you?
Yes, I mean, I think it was very unclear for a while exactly what Putin's intentions were and whether or not there was going to be a Russian invasion. It now looks as if that's not going to happen, at least in the short run. But it looked for a while as if that might be the case. And we were talking about a level of military mobilization, including short-range ballistic missiles, which could have resulted in a pretty horrendous confrontation inside Ukraine, which might possibly have drawn in Western powers, might possibly have drawn in NATO. Now, I don't know, George, whether or not that would in fact have happened, but what I do know is that there's a kind of wider context which is across the globe. There is a rising level of arms expenditure and militarization and nationalist tub thumping. And it's happening on both sides in relation to the Ukraine. Both the Ukrainian government and the Russian government are banging the nationalist drum, and they're doing that in large part for internal political reasons, I think. And it's very important, I think, to contextualize these international confrontations, because they play as much to the domestic audience as they do to the international audience. It's a way of building support for regimes that might sometimes be quite unpopular at home. It's worth just quoting this interesting statistic, which is that when Putin became very aggressive towards Ukraine back in 2014, and that of course is when they took over the Crimea, his opinion poll ratings absolutely soared. They reached a peak of about 80%. Now, his opinion poll ratings right now apparently are way down at around 30%. And I think we can interpret some of what has been going on of late in terms of how it plays to the domestic Russian audience, particularly in light of the fact that there does now seem to be a military withdrawal from the border.
Let me ask you the same question I asked Nikolai, but in different words. Are the West trying to push the Ukrainian government in Kiev into confrontation with Russia, or is the Ukrainian government in Kiev seeking to drag the West into that confrontation?
I would say a bit of both, but I think it's worth adding this qualifier really. And this really has been a pattern that goes right back to the Soviet era. Russia has tended to substitute military power for a relative lack of economic power. And in the confrontation between US imperialism and Soviet imperialism, and still now in the confrontation, I think, which it is effectively, between the EU and NATO on one side and the Russian government on the other, the economic power is with the West. So what the West is interested in doing is really expanding the area which can be dominated by Western-based capital. So I think the West's position is more defensive in a military sense, but they're prepared to use, I mean, NATO is an aggressive alliance, they're prepared to use military power, if necessary, to protect that position in the world, not least in Eastern Europe, where Western capital can move in. That's what underlies a lot of this tension, I think, between East and West in Europe today.
I don't believe that the West would have fought for Ukraine, do you?
No.
Very interesting. Now, Gerry Downing is a man of the far left in Britain with, how shall I put it, Gerry, an ambivalent attitude towards the former Soviet Union. I've absolutely no idea on which side of a conflict between Russia and Ukraine you would stand. But give us your perspective, unique on this platform.
Okay, my perspective is that in order to look at the roots of what's just happened in Ukraine, you have to look at the change of presidency in the United States. As we know, Trump was quite hotsy-totsy with Putin in a lot of things, and there's a lot of stories that he intervened on their behalf. And if you look at Russia today, for instance, you can see that there was quite a pro-Trump line from Russia today, and quite hostile to the Democrats. And of course, Biden's son made a big killing in Ukraine in the middle of all that.
Allegedly.
Allegedly, they say. But as I understand it, it was Zelensky's sort of statement that he intended to take back the Donbass and he intended to take back Crimea that initiated this conflict, because certainly Russia cannot afford to lose its Black Sea base in Sevastopol. This would be an absolute devastating blow to the whole Russian state and economy. It cannot lose that, and therefore it has moved its troops up. So my analysis is that the aggressors are the West, Western imperialism, and I have no hesitation in forming a united front with Putin against against that aggression. If you
As I live and breathe, I never thought I'd see those words come from your mouth.
The United Front, of course, is unconditional but critical. We are not uncritical of Putin. We know exactly what a political character he is. But in identifying U.S. imperialism as the main enemy, you always have to ally against the main enemy with whoever is being attacked. I don't look at, for instance, at Russia as an imperialist country. Certainly not in the Marxist sense of U.S. imperialism. U.S. imperialism dominates the planet. It can, for instance, put sanctions on Iran. And not alone can it put sanctions in Iran, but it can sanction other countries who failed to put sanctions in Iran for not putting sanctions in Iran. Russia couldn't do anything like that, or neither could China, actually, anything even approaching that. So the main enemy is always U.S. imperialism, but I have no illusions in the type of political regime that Putin runs in.
Welcome, Comrade Gerry, after a brief interlude of 50 years of visceral hostility between us. Let's go to Belgrade, to Serbia. Ernest Reid is a political analyst and a Russia-US relations expert.
Thank you for having me.
What is the regional impact of the US and Western rhetoric on Ukraine?
So if we had to assess the regional impacts, we must say that the region has been quite volatile for quite some time now. In fact, if we go back to the 80s, when the crumbling down of the USSR and the mismanagement of Gorbachev's regime brought about the Chernobyl disaster, and obviously in the 90s, the noughties, you have the NATO enlargements, and then in 2014, the events that are still quite very much felt today. So Blinken's, the Secretary of State, Blinken's remarks, threats, as they sound to Russia about the costs and consequences in case of Russia's aggressive and reckless behavior in the region, and Biden's announcement of commitments to Ukraine. To be honest, they don't really differ that much from previous US presidential administrations, but nevertheless, they do no good to the conflict. They only encourage the post-2014 Kiev regime leading them on, and they only strengthen this narrative of Kiev, the regime in Kiev being a puppet regime of Washington, which really encourages people in the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics along moral lines in terms of what they're fighting for.
Will there be an escalation or a de-escalation?
From the comments made by those present in the recent talks with France and Germany, it doesn't seem like the conflict is going to end anytime soon. It looks like it's just going to be dragged on for quite some time, and it just doesn't look good in the long term.
What is the impact of all those Russian troops on the border?
In the context of the events of what's happening at the moment, of course, we understand that just as if we had a military buildup in Northern Ireland, on the border between Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland, certainly in the context of recent history, it would certainly have a certain meaning. And in this instance, it simply means that Russia intends to defend its interests in the region. Russia does not intend to allow NATO to come any closer to what they already have. And at the same time, the military buildup from the other side, and NATO's military activities in the region, mean that NATO is not willing to back down either, that the US-led bloc is not willing to back down. So neither side is willing to back down, and it just simply means an ongoing conflict, proxy conflict.
Is there a hidden agenda behind the recent tensions in Ukraine? What are the broader implications of what's happening?
Well, I mean, it looks, certainly some people may have some good intentions, but heads of states, provided that the states have a certain degree of sovereignty, they always think in terms of self-interest, and if we are to be more specific, the interests of the ruling elites of those states. So it's always about ensuring the best benefits to costs ratio, and obviously the self-preservation, staying in power. So for the mainland Ukraine proper, and Donbass, they have goals of self-preservation. The only difference is that Ukraine sees achieving that, intends to achieve that through the elites, ruling elites in Ukraine intend to achieve it through the Euro-Atlantic integration, whereas Donbass see the goals being achieved, the goals of preservation, self-preservation being achieved through its integration into the Eurasian bloc led by Moscow. So, because obviously the US-led bloc and Moscow-led bloc are at odds with each other, this leads to nothing good. And if we are to talk about the US and Russia, their interests, of course, the US has military interests in the region. It's, if not ousting Russia, but at least sidelining Russia in the Black Sea, because Russia has the Black Sea fleet in Crimea, and that's one of the main reasons why Russia went in to Crimea, as well as protecting the Russian-speaking population, but also major national interest, the Black Sea fleet, which could be taken over any time. So, if I can add my 5 cents, I think the best would be for Ukraine to be an independent state, a bit like Austria, have it as a country in between Russia-led and US-led bloc. But that's in the ideal world, and we do not live in the ideal world, unfortunately. So things are the way they are.
Indeed, we don't live in an ideal world. More on this tantalizing story after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, coming from London, discussing the crisis between Russia and Ukraine, which is pregnant with the possibility of a nuclear war. Hey, they don't come along every day. Nikolai, just before the break, the rather clever young man from Belgrade was making the point that you made right at the beginning, that if the neutrality explicitly stated upon independence of Ukraine had been maintained, the relationship might not have reached this sorry pass. But we don't live in that world. We live in the world that we are actually in. The doctor and I both agreed earlier that the West would not have fought for Ukraine. In that sense, then, did Putin not miss a trick? Oughtn't he have actually drawn new boundaries between Russia and NATO by simply annexing the Russian areas of eastern Ukraine?
Boundaries or red lines, I'd say bloodlines, really. For Russia, NATO in East Ukraine or Crimea would be a complete unmitigated disaster. That might as well spell the end of Russia as we know it. So yes, Russia would definitely fight if pressed over Crimea and east of Ukraine. NATO, no, I can actually, I still remember a piece of thought in the National Archives I came across sometime, British National Archives I came across some time ago, under John Major. They were discussing actually the possibility or the possibility of taking Ukraine into NATO. And actually the line of thought was this, that it's better for the West and for NATO, for Ukraine to stay neutral, because if Ukraine is in NATO, NATO will have to fight for Ukraine under Article 5. If Ukraine is neutral, Russia, if she wanted to attack the West, would have to run over Ukraine first. So actually a neutral Ukraine would be beneficial to the West as it would be beneficial to Russia. And another thing, of course, is that now, when the Ukrainians are saying that they want to reclaim Crimea and East Donbass, I suggest to anyone who could master a bit of Ukrainian or use Google Translate and just get the gist of it, the school of thought on the Ukrainian side, on the nationalist side, of course, is that we don't need Russians there. Russians might as well pack up and go to Russia, or they must assimilate and become Ukrainians. Now, in my book, this is ethnic cleansing. And that's what Ukraine is doing whilst publicly aspiring to European values. And European values are very much different. Look at the cultural autonomy and linguistic autonomy for minorities in Europe. And that's the issue with Ukraine is twofold. One, it's better for the world, for Ukraine, for Russia and NATO, for Ukraine to be really neutral. And second, of course, is that by virtue of its geography, history and culture, Ukraine cannot be a unitary state, which is actually Kiev is trying to push down the throats of people in east of Ukraine. Ukraine, just like Russia, should be a federal state. And that would solve all the problems, basically. If Ukraine is federated, if Ukraine is neutral, and if Ukraine is having a mutually beneficial relationship with Russia, that's the best insurance policy for Ukraine and Western Europe.
If my aunt had a beard, she'd be my uncle. All these ifs, none of them are going to come to pass.
But that's the only solution. And unless this solution is implemented, yes, we will be having the situation on the Ukrainian border, you know, coming from kind of heightened tensions to some kind of relaxation.
Gerry, the more Nikolai talked of European values, the more I remembered Mr. Gandhi when asked what he thought of Western values. He said that would be a good idea. The European values that rampaged across the world and subjected most of the people of the world to imperial colonial satrapy are not values that enthuse you or me, but you can see the challenge, can't you, that the situation on the border now poses. Is the West a paper tiger? Is NATO a paper tiger? If it would have allowed, as I suspect it would, Russian forces to actually cross the border and solidify their position, of what use is NATO?
Indeed, but well, the situation now is, of course, that Russia has withdrawn a lot of its 100,000 troops, but significantly it has not withdrawn its hardware. It has kept its hardware on the front line. And now there is a summit due between Putin and Biden. The first one since, well,
Biden called for one, but Putin has rejected it.
Has he rejected it?
Yes, there will be no imminent summit anyway. But sorry to
well, he put it on ice, shall we say.
I read in the Financial Times that this was on the cards.
No FT, no comment, so you may be right.
And that this actually was an indication that NATO was not prepared to fight. But as for a peaceful solution, the very character of the Kiev government You know, it has this about it has the far right. It has it has Stefan Bandera as one of its great heroes.
These are Nazis you're talking about.
These are out and out Nazis, and of course in the East they regard Stefan Bandera as simply a Nazi thug, which he was. He slaughtered Jews and he slaughtered Poles in upwards of 100,000 and welcomed Hitler in. He was a bit disappointed in Hitler when he discovered that Hitler also wanted Ukraine for his Lebensraum, but that was a bit of a disappointment. But he was certainly as fascistic and there's a big contradiction there, because it's the one issue, for instance, that the Simon Wiesenthal Center has come into conflict with the Israeli government, Netanyahu and his ministers. They have said that really we cannot tolerate these people who they do not deny the Holocaust, they celebrate the Holocaust, and they make it clear they want to do it again. So the Simon Wiesenthal Center, who is very pro-Western and very pro-imperialism, and on this very issue, they say, "Oh no, we really can't accept this."
Dr. Faulkner, let me take advantage of your expertise here. To my disappointment, Russia is now just another capitalist country. Therefore, I'm not quite clear why the West hates Russia so much. I'm not clear why they could not have embraced the new capitalist Russia and made it a part of their system. What lies behind that unwillingness to do so, do you think?
Well, I differ from Gerry on this, really, because you see, I do see the world divided not just into areas that are controlled by gigantic great corporations, but also by extremely powerful nation states, great powers, if you like, that are effectively operating in an imperialist way. And I don't see any fundamental difference now between US imperialism and Russian imperialism, and indeed Chinese imperialism. I actually think there are now three superpowers, three great powers which dominate the world. I still think the US is more powerful than the other two. Most certainly it is militarily, to a degree still, even economically, in relation to China. And Russia is probably the poor relation compared with the other two. I accept there are differences, but I do see a world in which you have got three superpowers which are competing with each other. And they're competing with each other for markets, for access to raw materials, for investment opportunities, and therefore they are also necessarily competing militarily. They are using military power as a way of shoring up existing economic interests and pushing for more. But I would also stress that in relation to all three of them, there is a degree, and I've made this point before and I'll make it again now in this context where we're talking about three major powers that now threaten the peace of the world, effectively. What's happening inside each of these powers is that nationalism is being used as a way of cementing allegiance to the regime. And this is where I would disagree with Gerry, you see. There's no way I would identify with Putin any more than I would identify with the Chinese dictator, any more than I would identify with US imperialism. I don't think
kind of fourth campism.
Yeah. Well, I think what I would say is I'm against campism. I actually take the view that none of these regimes represent the interests of their own population and ordinary people in general.
Let me. It's a very interesting thesis. Where does Europe fit into this then? Are we just the tail of the American imperial dog, or do we have interests that are unique and separate?
I think it's an open question, isn't it? And it's one of the questions that is reflected in the whole Brexit argument, and whether Britain sees itself primarily as an economic and political partner of the United States or as an economic and political partner of Europe. I mean, and I don't know what the answer to that question is, and perhaps it's in the nature of the European beast that it is necessarily, and it's a huge, great capitalist trading bloc, of course it is, with its own, therefore its own military interests, which are to a large degree embodied by NATO, but possibly it's inherent in the nature of Europe, and this goes back a very, very long way indeed. It's the continent of warring states, isn't it? And now, in the context of the modern world, a continent of warring states being pulled in different directions by these two great power blocs represented by Russia and represented by Europe. And if the Europeans have the advantage in this, which they clearly do, it's primarily because of their greater economic weight. Putin has that much less to offer in terms of economic benefit, I think, which is why the old Soviet Union broke up and why so many of those bits have oriented towards the EU rather than wanting to remain in a relationship with Russia.
Let's go to a man who knows. Alastair Crooke is nowadays in Rome, Italy, but he's a former MI6 officer, a security and terrorism expert, and as a British diplomat, as they call them, he was the founder and director of the Conflicts Forum. But he was a high-level figure in MI6 and so might be able to shed some light on this debate. Alastair.
Thank you.
Is the Ukraine becoming the ground for a new Cold War, maybe even a hot war between Russia and the United States?
I think the answer to that is it is one principal ground for a Cold War. But really, the United States is pressing Russia in many spheres, in many fields at the same time. So it's also pressing Russia in Syria. It's pressing it in many ways, economically and politically. The language has become very aggressive towards Russia, and there are a lot of allegations. Every week, there's a new allegation made that Russia is being aggressive or Russia is doing this. So I would say that it's really sort of fifth generation warfare, Cold Warfare. In other words, it involves everything. It involves sanctions, economic pressures, public relations pressures, if you like, in terms of the geography pressures of NATO right up on the borders of Russia. It is a really full spectrum type of pressure that's been exerting.
Do you think we'll see conflict there soon, or will there be a de-escalation?
At the moment, there is a de-escalation. At his address to the Federal Assembly, President Putin gave a pretty clear warning about Russia's red lines to everybody, the West, and said, these are our red lines and just beware, because you will suffer greatly if you cross them. In other words, he said, we're really serious about it. After that, then there was a withdrawal of some of the large numbers of Russian troops that were on the border with Ukraine. However, all of the heavy weapon, or all of the heavy equipment, the artillery, and also the landing crafts in the Black Sea are still in position. But the men have come back because they had a big deployment of men on the ground. There was some 2 armies deployed on the border and a whole airborne corps in Crimea as well. So we're talking 100,000 men altogether. So naturally, you can't keep them in the field forever. They've gone back, but they can be redeployed very, very quickly. They were, I mean, it was, in fact, a feat that no Western country, and certainly not NATO, could imitate of fielding, putting into position 2 armies within a very, very short space of time.
Some people say Russia's trying to test the resolve of the new Biden-Harris administration. Do you buy that?
No, it's nonsense. I mean, I think anyone who's listened or knows Mr. Putin knows that Russia is very absolutely does not want a war with America. Does not even want a Cold War with America. It wants to be treated seriously as a serious regional power, but does not want a conflict with the United States, and particularly so because Putin has always stressed that any conflict in the borders could easily escalate. And if it escalates, then we are all in danger. It could escalate to something extremely dangerous. And he's warned very much about these exercises that, these things are taking place right up on his border, very close to St. Petersburg. I mean, there would be a minute's notice of a missile fired by the Americans before they arrived inside Russia. And he warned that, if things escalate seriously close to our borders, we have no alternative but to resort to nuclear weapons. I mean, surely and absolutely, Putin does not want that at all. So what would be the point of testing Mr. Biden? I mean, Mr. Biden, is doing his own things, but test him for what? No.
It's all a bit confusing, isn't it, Alastair? The Trump administration was said to be pro-Putin, and now the new American president is calling the president of Russia a killer. Could we say that the drive for this somewhat extreme shift is down to American domestic politics?
It's always complicated in the United States because, and particularly now, because you have many elements that are pushing in. Mr. Biden is not a full-time president, shall we say. And, there are many of the hawks from the Clinton-Obama period. Some of them are just, really hate Russia, crazy haters of Russia, have been in this process for long, for reasons that stretch back a long way. It's nothing to do with present events on the ground. This has been a long process of hostility towards Russia, are in that team. And who actually is the team, we don't really know. We know, of course, Blinken and Susan Rice and all these people, they're familiar friends. And we see all the neocons from the past are in the team. But who else is directing it? I mean, when Biden has a cabinet meeting or whatever, there's obviously people in the room behind him, a committee of some sort. Maybe there are differences of view, but I mean, who's actually making the final decision? I don't think is known really by anyone. So all these aggressive statements, I think, I mean, particularly these ones which are really out of line. I mean, we have never crossed this line of calling a head of state a killer. It's not the normal language of diplomacy or foreign policy, I can assure you. And so what is all this about? It's also about domestic issues. It's domestic issues because Biden is trying to revive the JCPOA. And he was a vice president, as you will know, during that Obama period. That Obama period where this was fiercely opposed by both Israel, by Netanyahu came and spoke at a joint session of Congress and said no to the deal, and others. And he will recall very clearly that Obama was very vulnerable to being called weak or an appeaser of Russia or an appeaser of Iran. And so there is obviously an element of this language and this sort of posture is about sending the message, I'm not weak, America's back. America's still strong. But really, it doesn't work so well this time because the world has moved on in the last 4 years. They can see that America doesn't really have the sort of political cohesion and the political ability to act as it used to. So all the world can see it's weaker. But he makes the noises to convince the Congress and the Senate that he's not going to be a weak president. But at the same time, I think a lot of this is about sending a message back to his audience that he's not weak and he won't be weak.
From the horse's mouth, that may be said to be the retired but still nascent British policy attitude towards this, mightn't it? That the John Major era council of caution is still emanating from the British. Do you think so?
The British, it's difficult to say right now because obviously Boris Johnson is being accused of causing up to Putin all the time. We hear this in the British media. Obviously, Britain going global, it has to work with the United States a lot more than with the European Union. So I think the jury is still out on what's the exactly what the British position is. I have to say, actually, going back to the build-up on the border, we have to remember, though, that the Russian build-up was in response to Ukrainian build-up. And here, coming back to Biden, for example, it's a case of, I think, the tail wagging the dog, because Zelensky might have got a wrong message when Biden came and said that the US is back in the world. Zelensky, just like Saakashvili in Georgia back in 2008, decided that this is the right moment, actually, to try and reclaim the territory, because this is his position. He wants to reclaim the lost territory, Crimea and East Ukraine. And they started building up the forces. And actually, the belligerence in their public pronouncements was ramped up. And it was a response from Russia. I'm afraid that the situation is just repeating the situation with Georgia. Now, if Zelensky still is of an opinion that he would be fully supported, backed up by the United States, he might make a misstep. But I think for now, the situation has been calmed down. I think the main message would be, and from Britain as well, that don't try and cross that red line, because otherwise it would be a repeat of the...
Well, that was the weight of Alastair's remarks there, I think. Dr. Faulkner, you have quite a challenging thesis that Russia and China are bad actors, but so is the United States. But all these bad actors either have to live with each other and find an equilibrium between each other, or kill each other. Which is it going to be?
I'm a bit more optimistic than that. I would like to think, George, that the future belongs to the people. But if the future does belong to the people, then it's going to be because we make revolt from below, revolution from below, that gets rid of all of them. And I honestly do believe that that has now become a matter of survival for the planet and humanity. There's a whole wider crisis, of course, than the one that we're talking about right now, an ecological crisis, a social crisis, and so on. We're talking about an aspect of that, which I think is the militarization of relationships between major powers, a growing possibility of war. And one of the things that worries me about, when I agreed with a lot of what MI6 has just said. I don't think I'd ever actually come to say that, but a lot of what that analysis...
I wished he was in the cabinet.
Yes.
The more I listened.
No, I agree with a lot of that analysis. But what I don't really agree with is the assumption that because it would not be in the interests of, say, the United States and NATO on one side and Putin on the other, for there to be a major war over Ukraine, therefore there won't be. You see, people said that in 1914.
They did.
And again, we've seen situations arise in international relations where neither side really wants a war because of the consequences of that for them, and yet they get themselves into a situation where they've either misjudged, they're misreading what the other actor is going to do, and then they find themselves in a situation from which they can't withdraw without a massive loss of face and possibly major consequences on the domestic front for losing face. So you get yourself into a situation where the war kicks off anyway, and in a sense, we as humanity, we've then lost control of these war machines that we've allowed our rulers to create. And the consequences will be paid. I mean, if there was a Third World War, as we all know, if there was a Third World War, it would dwarf the casualties that were inflicted by either the First or the Second.
Gerry, last word to you. The West hated the Soviet Union for obvious reasons. They loved Russia when it was lying drunk on the floor and having its pocket picked in the Yeltsin era. Yeah. And then they hated it again when Putin came to power. This says to me that they hate Russia because Putin has restored some of the lost international prestige for Russia and has restored something like a workable solution for Russia moving forward. I see you've dug an important editorial out of your pocket.
An important editorial from the Financial Times weekend, and it's an opinion by one Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and he is a billionaire who's been exiled. He spent 9 years in jail in Russia, and now he complains bitterly that regular scandals erupt in the form of corruption, money laundering, and even violent crimes, explosion, pointing, and murder. These are the very things for which he was jailed himself, and
Not long enough.
he got 9 years, and then Putin got soft and let him out. But his whole complaint is that it's the wrong people who are now being corrupt. He's not allowed to participate in the corruption himself because he's been exiled. He was at one stage the richest man in Russia. Now he's reduced to a few hundred million, the poor man. But these are the forces that are complaining bitterly here how corrupt Putin is. But they are complaining, in fact, that were we back in the era of Yeltsin, then that is the kind of regime we want, and that's the kind of regime that the US wants. It doesn't mean that you are now or that revolutionaries like myself are now become soft on Putin.
It's been fascinating. I wish we could have taken it longer, but we can't. Thanks very much for watching this edition of Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television.